All right, everybody, we're back with exercise 18 on histology. Um, so, inside of a multicellular organism like us, if cells have similar structure and function, they get organized into what we call tissues. And then different kinds of tissue come together to form organs. And the function of that organ is based on the various functions of the tissues inside of it and how those tissues are organized in order to form that organ. So, what histology does is study the distribution of various kinds of tissues throughout different organs and how those tissues are structured in order to give those organs function. So there are four major types of tissue that you're going to have to be able to identify, and we'll go over them in this lecture and lab. And let's start with epithelial tissue. Okay, so anytime your body needs some kind of covering to separate you from the outside world, to separate different organs from each other, anytime your body needs a barrier in order to block the movement of things like solutions, or a surface for exchanging molecules with the outside world or between your extracellular fluid and your blood, you are going to find epithelial tissue. Okay, so this is a dense tissue where the cells are all very close to each other, and the cells are attached to each other with what are called cell junctions. Okay, generally what happens is the junctions between the cells in epithelial tissue are tight, which means that fluid cannot generally seep between the cells. So your body uses that to control what gets into and out of your various tissues, because basically any molecule in a fluid on one side of the epithelial layer has to actually transit through the cytoplasm of these epithelial cells in order to get to the other side. And that gives your body a lot of control in terms of how things are moving around between different organs and tissues within organs. Okay, so there are different cell types. The cells can be cuboidal, meaning that they are roughly square shaped, or all of the edges are roughly the same length. They can be squamous, which means they are basically flat, almost two-dimensional, or cuboidal, columnar. And columnar has one edge that is a lot longer. They're a lot longer in one axis, I guess you could say, than in the other. Okay. Epithelial tissues can be either simple, meaning that there's one layer of epithelial cells, or they can be stratified, meaning that there's multiple layers. If you have a stratified epithelial tissue, then it gets named for the cell type at the apical surface. Okay, so I labeled here within an epithelial tissue, the actual epithelial cells are attached to what's called a basement membrane, and the side that's attached to the basement membrane is called the basal surface, and then the side away from the basement membrane is called the apical surface, right? The apex of the cell. Generally, the apical surface is going to be the one that comes into contact with, say, the contents of your intestines, or the urine that's being formed in your kidneys. Okay. Speaking of your kidneys, the next epithelium we're going to talk about is the one that lines the nephrons in your kidneys. Okay, so the functional unit, the thing that actually does the job of the kidneys, is called a nephron. And it's basically a really long, convoluted tubule. And the inside of that tubule is an empty space called a lumen. And surrounding the tubules is kidney tissue, and with a lot of blood vessels in it. And what happens is, through the work of the tubule, material is exchanged between blood and the lumen of the tubule. So the solution that collects within the lumen of the tubule ends up being urine. Okay, so the lumen of these tubules all eventually connect up to each other and allow for the urine that's produced in the kidney to drain into your bladder, which you then eventually release. Okay, so the epithelial tissue that lines the lumen is the one that determines what gets into and out of your urine, basically, from your other bodily fluids and your bloodstream. Similarly, in your intestines are a hollow tube, and the hollow part in the middle is what we call the lumen. The images here show your intestines, and then on the left, and then the middle one is a cross section through your intestine, and then the one on the right is a magnified view of part of those little extensions that reach into the lumen of your intestine. So, like the kidneys, your intestines can take things out of the lumen and put them into the blood. But unlike the kidneys, nothing comes out of the blood and goes into the intestines. Okay, so digestion is happening in the lumen, which is lubricated by mucus, which is secreted by the epithelial layer. And then water and useful nutrients are absorbed from the lumen through the epithelial tissue into the bloodstream. Okay. What comes out of your intestines is basically everything that wasn't absorbed. Okay. Your body does not add anything other than digestive enzymes and bile and things like that to the material that you put in your mouth. All right, the next kind of tissue we're going to talk about is connective tissue. The trademark of connective tissue is that the living cells within it are widely spaced, and they're going to be surrounded by some kind of matrix. Okay, and generally that matrix is going to help absorb physical stresses of some type. Okay, the matrix can be largely liquid, as in blood and lymph. Okay, lymph is just kind of the extracellular fluid throughout your body. Or the matrix can be relatively loose. Basically, I could take any organ in your body, and if I took all the living cells out, I would still have something shaped like that organ. Okay, and what I would have left is the matrix, and it's basically made up of proteins, sometimes with carbohydrates in there. But it's something for the cells, the living cells, to attach to and help hold that organ shape and sort of just structure. Okay. Other kinds of connective tissue are more dense. Things like ligaments and tendons, and then the most dense one, which uses minerals to make it even harder, is bone. Okay, so let's talk about cartilage first. Okay, you find cartilage in your joints, and basically it's a lubricating surface, padding to help keep things slick so that they slide easily against each other. As you get older, it can erode away, right? And that can be one form or one reason for arthritis that people experience with joint pain. Athletes can often erode it away in certain places as well. So it can be lost with use. Cartilage is similar to tendons, which are connective tissue that attach muscles to bone, and ligaments, which is connective tissue that connects bones to bone. It's mostly has a matrix made of proteins, but there's also some carbohydrate in there too. The cells that produce the matrix are called chondrocytes. And basically, they live in little pockets within that matrix called lacunae. Okay, so the lacunae are the cavities inside the matrix, and the cells live inside those lacunae, and they secrete the proteins and the carbohydrates that make up the matrix of the cartilage. Okay, so in this picture you can see on the top right, all that sort of light pink stuff is matrix. And the darker spots are the living cells within the lacunae. Sometimes it looks like there's a hollow area, sometimes not. Each lacunae can have one or more than one cells in it. The most dense matrix that you'll find in your body is in compact bone. There's also spongy bone, which has the same basic parts, just not as densely packed in together. But in the compact bone, the really hard mineralized parts of your skeletal system, the basic unit is what's called an osteon. And each osteon has a central canal called a Haversian canal. There are living cells throughout your bones. Even in the hardest parts of your bones, there are living cells. So living cells need to be able to communicate with each other. They need to be able to communicate with your brain. They also need nutrients, and they have to get rid of waste. So the Haversian canals contain nerves, arteries, and veins. Okay, and then growing around each Haversian canal within an osteon, right? Each osteon has one of these central canals, the Haversian canal, and growing around that canal in concentric rings are lamellae, and those lamellae are the matrix. Okay, and kind of between the lamellae is where you're going to find the living cells, and they're called osteocytes. So the sort of little cavity where you find them is again called lacunae. Okay, and so you can see in the picture, sort of at the bottom right of the image here, the really dark circle in the middle is the Haversian canal. Okay, and then the sort of darker ovals that form rings around that, those are the living cells. And it kind of looks like the rings of a tree. Those are the lamellae, right? That form out from that Haversian canal. And the lamellae are the actual mineralized protein matrix that is secreted by the living cells in the lacunae. And again, remember, this is a really dense matrix. Okay, so these cells still need to be able to communicate with your circulatory system and your nervous system. Okay, so there are little canaliculi that connect the cells within different lacunae to each other and back to the Haversian canal. All right, the last kind of connective tissue to discuss is blood. Blood actually has a liquid matrix. We call it plasma. So there's an image on the top left here that shows sort of all the different components of blood, all the different cells. We're really not going to talk about platelets or white blood cells, what they do. The image on the top right shows a sample of blood. What you would see if I took blood from a person and spun it down in a centrifuge. The more dense objects move to the bottom of the tube when you spin it in the centrifuge. So the red part at the bottom is the red blood cells. Then there's a small white layer called the buffy coat. That's where you're going to find all of the white blood cells that make up your immune system. And then the sort of yellow straw-colored layer on the top, which is the largest by percent of your blood volume, is the plasma. Okay, it's basically just a solution. It carries around nutrients from your intestine to every cell in your body. It carries waste away from every cell in your body to your kidneys and your lungs and your liver. And you need that plasma there, right, to help keep all the cells moving. The plasma is what's actually being pushed by the beating of your heart, and everything else just gets carried along with it. Okay. The only other like really important cell in here that we need to talk about is the red blood cells. Red blood cells carry a protein called hemoglobin. Oxygen binds to hemoglobin in your lungs, and then those red blood cells move all throughout your body and drop that oxygen off to cells that need it in order to burn your food for energy. Okay. All of those cells in your body then produce carbon dioxide, which dissolves into the plasma portion of your blood primarily, right? And as the blood moves past your lungs, the carbon dioxide basically diffuses into the air spaces, and then you breathe it out. Now, in human red blood cells, as they mature, they lose their nucleus so that there's more space inside for hemoglobin proteins, right? The more volume inside the red blood cell that's empty, the more hemoglobin, copies of hemoglobin protein you can put inside of it. Okay, the next kind of tissue we need to talk about is muscle tissue. There are three basic types. There is skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Again, like epithelial tissue, this is a very dense tissue with a lot of cells very close to each other. These cells are well connected to each other with different types of junctions. Okay. The purpose of muscle cells is to contract. Okay. And by that, I mean when they get the proper signal, the cell gets shorter. Okay. And that helps change the shape of different parts of your body. Okay. There are two proteins called actin and myosin that work with each other to make that cell shorter. Basically, what happens is the myosin grabs onto the actin and bends over, okay, which makes the actin filaments slide over the myosin filaments. And when you have a lot of cells that are all contracting at the same time, you can do things like bend your arm, you can do things like pump your blood, and you can do things like keep food moving through your intestines. Okay, so it's really important that this is coordinated well, and the different types of muscle have slightly different ways that they do this based on their needs. Okay, the least organized type is the smooth muscle. You're going to find this in blood vessels and organs that have to actually keep something moving. Okay, really it's just going to be in your intestines and in your blood vessels. You're not going to find it in like your liver or your lungs or anything like that. So you have some questions on your worksheet about different layers of muscle in a cross section of an intestine. Often you find smooth muscle arranged in sort of different orientations. And the orientation that you put the cells in is going to determine what axis they contract in. Okay, so they always contract from the two far ends of the muscle cell come closer together, right? And this is kind of like when we looked at the earthworm, and that's why I have the earthworm on the side there. Remember, there was a layer of muscle that was a ring around the outside, and then there were longitudinal muscles that ran the length of the worm, and working together they could change the shape of the worm, but each type of muscle was doing it in a different way. Okay, so hopefully that's a clue for your question there. The next type is skeletal muscle. This one is the most organized. During development, individual cells actually fuse together to form large muscle fibers. And then kind of like a red blood cell, those muscle fibers basically fill up entirely with actin and myosin, right? Those are the proteins that work together to make the cells contract. Okay? Unlike a red blood cell, though, the nucleus isn't lost. The nucleus, or the different nuclei, because again, each fiber is made up of multiple cells that have fused together, right? So all of the different nuclei from a single fiber basically get pushed out to the periphery, right? To the outside edge of that muscle fiber. So you often see them as these kind of like purple blobs on the larger muscle fibers. Okay, and then the striations inside, those striations are caused by the different densities of actin and myosin proteins within that muscle fiber. All right, the last kind of muscle tissue you need to know is cardiac muscle. They are striated, although it doesn't generally show up as obviously as in the skeletal muscle. In cardiac muscle, they don't fuse together. So you still have individual cells. Each one only has one nucleus. Okay, they do not come together to form multi-nucleated fibers. Okay. So skeletal and smooth muscle generally are going to contract in when they get a signal from your nervous system. Okay, but cardiac muscle is an involuntary response. Smooth muscle is mostly involuntary as well, but it is going to be responding to signals that it receives. But cardiac muscle is going to mostly keep itself contracting on a rate that it sets for itself, right? There's an area of your heart called the sinoatrial node that basically functions as the pacemaker, and it starts every new contraction of your heart. And it kind of works like a neuron. In a neuron, there's something called an action potential that I'm sure you'll learn about in lecture if you haven't already. And different ions diffuse in and out of the cytoplasm, or they're pumped across the cell membrane, which causes an electrical signal to be sent from one neuron to the next. Cardiac muscle cells work in a similar way. Changes in ion concentration within the cytoplasm of the cells cause them to contract. Okay? And even though each cardiac muscle cell is just one cell, they are heavily connected to their neighbors. Okay, so these cells branch out a lot, and where two cells connect, it's called an intercalated disc. And those intercalated discs have two different kinds of connections. There are things called desmosomes, which basically keep them attached to each other and lined up in the right way. And then there are also things called gap junctions. And gap junctions are basically tunnels from one cardiac muscle cell to the next, so that the cytoplasm of all these cells is actually continuous. And having a continuous cytoplasm helps that signal move from one cell to the next in a really coordinated fashion, right? Because if your heart isn't pumping in a coordinated fashion, then it's not actually going to accomplish anything, right? That's what happens when you get an arrhythmia, okay? All right, the next kind of connective tissue to talk about, and it's actually the last kind, is nervous tissue. Again, I imagine you're going to learn a lot more about how neurons work in lecture. Okay, they use something called an action potential to receive signals from other neurons or from like mechanical sensors in your skin or nerve endings in your eye, and then they send a signal out to other neurons, eventually to your brain, right? The activation of various neurons in your brain makes a decision, and then a signal gets sent back out through neurons to the rest of your body to make some kind of reaction. Okay. Neurons have a lot of processes. Basically, these are just long, skinny extensions that come out of the cell body. The cell body is where you're going to find the nucleus. Dendrites are the neuronal processes that receive signals. And then the axon is the neuronal process that sends it to the next neuron. Okay, or maybe it sends a signal to a muscle and makes a muscle contract. Okay. Nervous tissue also includes what are called glial cells. They're generally going to be a lot smaller than neurons. They do not participate in the receiving or sending of signals, but they provide a lot of support and nourishment functions for the neurons themselves. Okay. In your brain, glial cells kind of play the role as a extracellular matrix as well, for the neurons to hold sort of the shape of your brain together. But they do a lot of other stuff, but that's sort of outside the scope of what you need to know. All right, the last few questions are about skin. Okay, so let's start with human skin. So we are not aquatic organisms, and every organism that evolved up on the land, right? So we have our sort of early reptile ancestors to thank for this, have what's called keratinized skin. So the very outer layer of your skin is made up of dead cells that, kind of like a red blood cell, have filled up entirely with protein. Okay, but it's even worse than a red blood cell. Okay, because the inside of your surface skin cells is completely full of a protein called keratin. Okay, by the time it reaches the surface of your skin, I should say. They don't start out that way, right? You have multiple layers of cells in what's called your epidermis, right? That's the outer layer of your skin. When new cells are made, they're not dead, okay? But as they get pushed towards the surface, because the oldest cells are always falling apart, or not falling apart, but falling off, you're shedding skin cells everywhere you go all day long, okay? As they approach the surface, they fill up more and more and more and more with this keratin, which is also the protein that makes up your hair and your finger and toenails. Okay, and that's a good thing because any bacteria, or these days viruses, that attach to a dead keratinized cell can't do anything to harm you, right? There's no living cell there for them to infect. When the dead cell falls off, anything that's attached to it is going to fall off as well. Okay, so the outer layer, which gets keratinized, as I said, is called the epidermis. The deeper layer is called the dermis. And the dermis does not get keratinized. Okay, so it's not like constantly dying the way your epidermis is. And then in us, underneath the dermis is an adipose layer, right? We are endotherms, which means we produce and hold on to body heat. And the adipose layer helps us do that, right? It's in like a whale or a seal or something. That's what we call blubber. Okay, so that's where you find not all the adipose in a human's body, right? But a lot of the adipose is going to be underneath the dermis there. The epidermis actually dives into the dermis to create what are called follicles. Okay, and follicles produce hair. Some people obviously produce more hair than others, right? Males and females generally produce hair in different places than each other. Okay, but all of us have these follicles all over our body. It's just whether or not they get activated and stay active. And any follicles that get active, the cells that line it are going to be secreting keratin in order to build that hair filament. Okay, associated with those follicles are what are called sebaceous glands, and they produce a substance called sebum. And sebum is basically an oily substance that gets secreted out onto the surface of our skin to try to keep it soft It also has some antimicrobial properties. Okay. Um, Different areas of your body have different concentrations of follicles and sebaceous glands. Different parts of your body can produce slightly different versions of sebum. And in some parts of your body, like your armpits, right, there are actually bacteria that live there. You are a host and they don't do you any damage or anything like that, but they can actually feed off of the sebum and produce things which can give you body odor. Okay, but sebum is a good thing. If we didn't have it, then our skin would basically be scaly, like a reptile. Okay, completely separate from the follicles, there are sweat glands, and each sweat gland basically draws water from the surrounding tissues, right, and from the bloodstream, and produces sweat. Okay, and it is connected to the surface through a pore in the epidermis, and the sweat just comes out through that pore. Mammary glands, right, in females that produce milk are actually modified sweat glands. So milk is actually just kind of sweat that has a different, it's a water-based solution that has a different mix of proteins and fats in it than typical sweat does. Okay, and then the last thing that you are asked to look at this week is frog skin. So some similarities and some differences with human skin. Okay, so frogs are amphibians. They spend a lot of time in the water, or at least they need to live in places where they can stay relatively moist because their skin is not waterproof. Just like us, they have an epidermis, which is the outermost layer, and a dermis, which is the deeper layer. But their epidermis does not produce keratin. Okay, and they don't have any hair, they don't produce sebum, right? And they don't produce any sweat. Okay. Another thing they can do across their skin that we can't is gas exchange. Okay, so that's one of the big reasons that they need to keep their skin moist, right? Also because without keratin, they are not waterproof themselves. Okay, so they could actually die by dehydrating through their skin. Okay, so within the dermis, just below the epidermis, are going to be mucus glands, and they secrete. It's kind of like sweat because it's a watery solution, but it has way more proteins in it than our sweat does. Okay, and it's meant to sort of form a layer on top of the skin that holds moisture there. Okay, just like mucus does inside your mouth, okay, and nose. Unlike us, they are not endotherms, so they don't try to hold on to their body heat. Okay, so there's no adipose underneath the dermis. Okay, so the dermis is going to sit right up against a muscle layer. And some species, like this poison dart frog in the picture on the top left, actually produce poisons or toxins in their skin to help deter predators from eating them. Some of them are so strong that they could kill a person, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of people who like lick toads or something to go on a trip, but that's kind of the basic idea, right? But you have to be careful with that kind of stuff because some of them are definitely strong enough to kill a person. The poison dart frogs, like the one in the picture there, got their name because Amazonian natives would rub arrowheads on their skin to try to get this poison, and then they would use that to fire into their enemies, right, and kill them easier than just an arrow alone. I guess that's, sometimes that's not enough to just pierce someone with an arrow. Okay. Like the frog in the picture there, it's if they produce this poison from these glands deeper in their dermis, they still don't want to be bitten, right? It can still be bad to be bitten, even if a predator, would be harmed by biting you, right? Because some young predators don't know that. Okay, so you have to advertise the fact, and that's what these bright colors are about. It's called aposematic coloration, where the idea is that if I'm a dumb young mammal, right, and I don't know any better, and I try to eat one of these frogs and I get really sick, then the next time I see a frog that's really colorful like this, I will avoid it and stay away. So even though some frogs are going to get injured here and there, a lot of them are going to be protected based on the experience that the predators had with other members of their species or even similar species. All right, so I think that's it for exercise 18. You should have everything you need to answer the questions on those worksheets. All right, thanks.